financial readiness for sure is like the number one thing that most founders or co-founders would really want to consider, and then taking opportunity costs into consideration.
Today we're talking about what you need to consider when you're building out your initial team as a startup. We discuss the pros and cons of outsourcing versus hiring in-house, when is it the right time or too premature to hire, and also when to consider diversity metrics. We're honoured to have Shefali on the podcast, who's the head of talent at Doccla, a Series B health tech startup. She has years of experience ranging across various VC-backed startups and brands. Her key areas of focus have always surrounded building the right talent pipelines, acquisition and retention, and also employer branding. I'm Anshika, I'm the founder of Eternity, a CRM designed to streamline the wedding industry for couples and businesses alike. And I'm so excited to be hosting the Bay Lab podcast today, which is powered by HSBC Innovation Banking. Let's get into it. Thank you so much, Shefali, for joining us for today's Bay Lab podcast episode. I'm so excited to be talking to you about all things building your team as a startup, especially those first few hires. So let's get straight into it. So starting off, what would you say is the right time to make your first hire? I think as founders, especially in the early stage, you often have that chicken and egg problem where you need the right revenue to actually be able to afford a substantial team, but then equally you need that team to help generate the product to generate that revenue. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Anshika, for having me. And you're absolutely right. It is that chicken and egg issue which most founders do face. And it's not just kind of what to hire, it's the characteristics, it's the need. And so I'd say at this point, it's this kind of balancing act for expansion, for operational purposes, and looking at bottlenecks within your ops, or the operational side of the business, but also kind of a longer term view as well, on the entirety of the business and where you foresee the business going. So I'd say the right time should be very much based around revenue growth, the efficiency, so operational efficiency, that is, and really trying to understand the opportunity cost of not hiring someone in that time. So whether that be missing opportunities, because your current setup doesn't have the right resource or the volume of resource that you need. And also founder burnout as well, because of course in the early days, lots of founders actually do everything themselves, or co-founders, working in conjunction with each other, they do everything themselves. So trying to kind of eliminate that kind of overwhelming feeling is really important at this point. But at the same time, understanding where the skills gaps might be longer term, hiring for scale, i.e. hiring for generalists, is probably quite an important kind of thought process to have at this point. So maybe trying to find someone that could probably wear a few different hats is probably quite an important facet at this point. But of course, cost, financial readiness for sure is like the number one thing that most founders or co-founders would really want to consider, and then taking opportunity costs into consideration.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love what you said there around your first hire also wearing so many hats, because as we know, founders and co-founders themselves are so used to wearing so many different hats. And I know that you've touched a little bit around financial readiness. As a startup, though, when it comes to making your first hire, what do you think about the balance of hiring someone who's perhaps a generalist, like a founder's associate, or someone who can support you during the admin side of things, versus hiring maybe a specialist, for example, a sales specialist, who's actually going to be in a revenue generating role? I know that it's definitely a question that I always have, and many other founders that I speak to. You never know if you should put that cost towards something where you might generate direct ROI, because obviously admin and founders associates are kind of indirect ROI as well, and they're just as important.
It's a really personal circumstance in terms of where your business is at. So there's not kind of going to be a rule that fits all. It's going to be very much where your business is at and where you see the next kind of 6 to 12 months going, I would say, in those early days. If you, as a founder, feel that actually there isn't enough revenue, and all the efforts so far by, the team, i.e. themselves or outsourced support, it's not working, then it may be kind of prudent to look at the option of a revenue generating resource. Some of the companies that I've worked at have had the opposite problem. So at the moment I work for a VC-backed Series B scale-up called Doccla, and they're a digital health company, and they're not very old. They're only 5 years old, but they've seen great success quite quickly. And when they started hiring for their first few hires, their issue wasn't necessarily like the revenue side, because actually they were doing okay, not fantastic, but they were doing okay. But really the bottlenecks for growth and for further growth and for opportunities to be captured was the operational efficiency. So as a part of what they do, they have to pack boxes. They're, a part of their business is also in logistics. And this was a big bottleneck. So they had to find someone that was going to do that part, but also do other things as well. And I think kind of touching on the first point that you kind of spoke about was having, obviously the ideal scenario is that this person could come in and contribute to a bit of everything, enjoys that business development side or the customer success side. So the clients that you do already have, you're getting the most out of them. They're getting the most value out of those clients. But equally, operations isn't, a bottleneck. I think that's pivotal. So very much dependent on the business size, where the business is at. But if revenue isn't there, then I think a resource dedicated to revenue generation is probably quite key.
Yeah, I like that. I like identifying the bottleneck, because it could be something completely different when you actually do that analysis and look within your business. I guess you've mentioned a little bit around outsourcing, and there's such a common debate around, should we actually hire in-house or should we outsource it? So for example, should we get founders associate in-house, or should we have a virtual assistant based elsewhere? Should we hire a tech team in-house, or should we outsource it to freelancers? What are your thoughts on that? I'd love to hear it.
So I suppose it's very much like with all kind of startups and scale ups. It depends where you're at. I quite like, when you're early stage, to have a VA, so a virtual assistant who could actually probably cover quite a broad range of things for you, administrative tasks, which will free up time for you to do other things that are kind of, that are required from you face to face, and actually focus on revenue generation as a founder. The con with that is of course, they're not going to be an extension of yourself. They're not going to be running mini projects for you. They're not going to be, involved in any sort of business development or commercial activities. They are there for that administrative load that you would like to then delegate to. Whereas a founder's associate, typically in the experience that I've had, we've hired founders associates that are fairly qualified and have aspirations themselves of becoming founders one day, and want to understand that scale up and that startup journey and go through it with the founder really close by as their right hand person, so that they can that it kind of equips them to do their own thing at some point. And this might be right from, like I mentioned in Doccla's situation, packing boxes, right through to being involved in discussions with investors and analysis and research of investors that are, going to be helpful and contribute other than the financial side of things. So founders associates, I'd say, are incredible to have, and an incredible asset to have in any sort of business, but it can be quite costly. So, I think within a year or two, salaries do tend to go up, and I think that's something that founders should bear in mind, that, these are really valuable and kind of really knowledgeable individuals that are coming into the business, potentially having other offers on the table from investment banks and, quite highly paid graduate roles that they may have foregone to join their startup and taken a pay cut for, but with the premise that they get the knowledge and a potential pay rise a little bit later on in their journey. So I think that's really I think it's prudent for founders to know that whilst they get, so much fantastic value out of FAs in the initial days, if, things are tight, and they themselves may not be taking a salary, then perhaps a virtual assistant may be, the way forward for them.
Yeah, well, exactly to that point. Founders, a lot of the time, especially in early stages, do forego their own salary. And what are your thoughts around when you may be feeling stretched and you know that you need a resource, and you may or may not be generating revenue, and if you are, you may or may not be paying yourself? At what point do you think founders should continue to forego their salary when it comes to making a new hire? And what I mean by that is, if you're not paying yourself, should you actually bring someone on board and pay them? Or in your experience, have you found that's motivating, demotivating? I'd love to hear about the pros and cons around that.
It's a funny one, because when you're a founder, you obviously own, the business. So that's a high incentive to make it work, versus if you're an employee, which of course, when you're in startups and certainly tech startups, you may well have options in the company or equity in the company. So there is that motivator, and that is an option of a way and a route to hire early stage as well, where you either give someone a really low salary and give them quite a lot of equity, or vice versa. To answer your question, it's a tough one, and very much a personal circumstance to the respective founder. Some of the founders that I know, whilst they don't take a salary through the business, have tried to curate somehow a side hustle of some sort, or some sort of financial stability for themselves. So whether that be through property income and rental income, whether that be through selling products on Amazon, whether that be through kind of weekend work or consulting work on the weekends, somehow they have created some sort of financial stability. I mean, in some instances, it really is, perhaps if they're with someone, then they might be leaning on those respective partners or parents, and it's why we hear so much of, when you kind of look back at some of these Silicon Valley startups, a lot of those journeys begin from parents' garages or parents' homes or childhood bedrooms. And this is the very reason, so that they have the financial bandwidth to sustain themselves, forego a salary, so no rent, minimal outgoings, and that way pour everything into the business, including perhaps hiring their number two, employee number two. And again, when things progress, if there is some sort of revenue along the way, it's still seen that most founders don't necessarily take a high salary. They still take a reasonable salary to cover basis and cover basic costs at home, and that is so that they can elevate the business, they can keep growing the business. And of course, it's different when you're a VC backed startup, because then there's a bit more kind of regulation there, and it's important to take a salary at that point, because you're probably starting to build out quite an expensive team at that point. But until there's been some sort of kind of revenue generation and commitment, I think it's fairly common for founders not to take a salary, or to take a fairly modest salary.
Absolutely. And actually, on that note, what do you see as some very common red flags that founders do when it comes to making either their first, second, third, or even 10th hire?
One of the examples that springs to mind is kind of founders getting quite excited by big names in the industry. So like they if you're trying to hire perhaps your first tech hire, they may well see Facebook or Apple on a CV, and it's the thought of someone from one of these prestigious companies, one of the FANGs, joining your organization is fairly exciting. But what's not necessarily assessed at that point is how suitable and how adaptable they are to working in a startup environment. And I think businesses have changed with time. I think this was certainly really relevant. Like, this point was very relevant, perhaps 5 years ago. There's been a lot of learnings from other startups now, because that whole ecosystem has developed a little bit more. But certainly 5-10 years ago, this was very much the case, where this was a big red flag, where you'd hire someone from quite a large organization, a large corporate established company with policy, with protocols, with process, with teams, and then someone coming into, what may essentially be a one-person band, is a very different scenario, and there is a struggle there, because it certainly could be a struggle there, because people from larger organizations generally have a support network. They can delegate lots of tasks out to other people, and there's a sense of kind of soundboarding with other team members, and they may not actually be doing the work themselves. Most of the startup CTOs, head of engineering, engineering managers, they're all hands-on. There's no aspect of someone taking a strategic role in a startup. Everyone is doing and contributing to the actual work, as opposed to kind of managing managers and so on. So I think this is quite a big one to look at when, like a red flag that I'd seen in the past. Another one is startup experience, which kind of semi-covered in the first point, but it's certainly very relevant today as well, that having people with, both startup and scale-up experience is so important, so that they've experienced that wearing of many hats, the experience of lack of structure and policy, which can be frustrating for employees. So I think those are two of the really big red flags. And I think lastly, salary as well. Because I think in the initial, as a business, as a startup business, you might be able to offer a decent salary, but that might not necessarily come with lots of pay rises moving forward, and lots of progression moving forward, because in a small company, there's only going to be, a certain ceiling that you hit. And I think that's really important to cover during the interview process as well, that as the company scales, there may well be opportunities, but for now, this is what the opportunity is. So those are the 3 points I'd say.
We hope you're enjoying the episode so far. We just want to give a quick shout out to our headline partners, HSBC Innovation Banking. One of the biggest challenges for so many startups is finding the right bank to support them. Because you might start off and try to use a traditional bank, but they don't understand what you're doing. You're just talking to an AI assistant, or you're talking to somebody who doesn't really understand what it is you've been trying to do. HSBC have got the team that are built out over years to make sure they understand what you're doing, they've got the deep sector expertise, and they can help connect you with the right people to make your dreams come true. So if you want to learn more, check out hsbcinnovationbanking.com.
That's so helpful, and I think everything you've mentioned there is something that all founders who are listening to this can kind of take forward in for any interviews that they're doing with their first few hires, because they're all points that you should lay out on the table quite early on, especially the point around you're going to be in a doing role, not in a strategy role to begin with. And this is the highest rank that you're probably going to get if you're joining as a CTO. And so very, very helpful tips there. Thank you, Shefali. And I guess last but definitely not least, I want to touch a little bit on diversity, because we see it so much in larger corporations. We see it so much with on your cap table, making sure you have the right diversity metrics. I want to talk about it when you're a startup, because I think hiring for a startup, I've experienced firsthand, can be quite difficult, because you need the fit of the right person who's used to all of those things, like you said, who's the right salary band, wants to be a doer, and sees really that vision and mission early on. And how do you balance that from a diversity point of view when you're hiring as a startup? Say you're a solo founder or co-founders, are these metrics that you should set in stone to begin with and communicate perhaps to your investors? Are these ones that you should have in the back of your head? Kind of how does that play a role when you're making the first few hires?
Sure. So I think, generally speaking, the rule of thumb is hiring the best person for the job, and keeping, of course, in mind diversity is important, but at the same time, it's the skill and the practice that they bring to the table that should be kind of the reason that they're hired. So kind of that's the number one point. And diversity metrics come from quite a broad range. It's anything from kind of gender to race to socioeconomic backgrounds to demographics. So it's quite a broad range. And when I speak to, candidates now within my role, it's something I cover within the interview process, because for some people, this is a really important facet. So it's not just for investors. It can be to also attract other people into the business as well. And I think whilst it's important in your initial hiring, as it should be, because it's at the back of your mind as a founder, hiring the best person should always be the decision maker there, not necessarily, where they live or, how they identify themselves. So I'd say whilst it's an important kind of facet to keep in your mind, and it's probably less relevant when you're hiring one person, but certainly more relevant when you're hiring a whole team of people, so that you're getting a sense of, a real sense of diversity of thought onto your team. And I think that's the emphasis that diversity brings, bringing different people from different walks of life together in, one space, to have different opinions on matters, because that's when magic happens. That's when creativity happens, when you can have different, kind of rational conversations about things that you might not agree with, and come to a resolution on what would look good. And that's the whole purpose of why investors and, general VCs, but also other people are interested in diversity metrics, and to have a sense of belonging as well. But certainly more relevant when you're at a later stage, as kind of seed onwards, really, when you've got a slightly bigger team, and important to, at that point, have a look at who's on the table, who's having these discussions about where your product is going. And an example I love is I can't remember which car manufacturer it was, but there was a story around the product team building a seatbelt that was only suitable really for a male and, male body types, etc. There's also another kind of anecdote with Apple, where Apple originally made quite large iPhones that wouldn't necessarily fit in perhaps, a female hand. So, there's lots of reasons for having diversity, gender, age, demographic. And I think those certainly start to kind of become more relevant and more prevalent as your company is starting to grow.
I love that. Thank you so much, Shefali. You've given us such tangible, actionable pieces of advice in this session today, and I'm so glad that we got you on. Of course, as we wrap up for the Bay podcast, we always have questions that we ask everyone who attends, which some may find easier than others to answer. But firstly, I want to know, who are 3 Asians in Britain doing incredible pieces of work that you think the audience should check out?
I think there's definitely more than 3. So I'm forgive me if I start to reel off a whole register and a whole roster of names. I think the first one that I'd love to name is an Iranian refugee who is really well known. Actually, they're not an underdog. They are really well known in the tech space. It's Ali Parsa. So Ali Parsa was the CEO of a company called Babylon Health, who I worked with quite closely for about 2.5 years of my career. And he was and still is an extremely inspiring individual, not just for the fact that he created one of the first unicorns within digital health in the UK, but also learning resilience from him. So he floated his company onto the stock exchange, and the company did well for a little while, and then didn't do so well, as we see with companies. And I think the important thing here is that he's not let that affect him, and he's literally just in the last kind of few days announced his new venture, which I may well mispronounce, but I think it's called Quadrivia. So he's kind of come back onto the scene, and I think that's absolutely fantastic, so inspiring and so telling of his character, and definitely one to watch, as I think one of Britain's greatest entrepreneurs. So he would be my first. The second I'll kind of do as a dual, because it's a personal one. So that would be my brother-in-law, actually, Varun Banot, who is the founder of a business called Magic AI. And this has come from a really personal journey from him, where actually he was a little bit overweight, and he invested a great amount in his own well-being, his diet, and has henceforth created a mirror, an AI mirror, which is in essence an AI personal trainer. So you can exercise from home in your own space. And I think that's hugely inspiring, taking something that you've had a problem with in the past and turning it into a solution. Is hugely inspiring. And notwithstanding, I've seen him go through that whole journey from building the startup. So I think definitely someone to watch and a business to watch. And then out of the tech space, I would say a business to watch is Win Legal, who is making strides within the legal sector and incorporating tech within quite a conservative industry. And lo and behold, that the founder is my husband. So again, quite a personal one. So I'll keep the two together, given we only have 3 options. And the third is Rupa Ganatra Popat, who has actually come on to one of your podcasts, I believe, in the past. And she supports female entrepreneurs. She's founded her own VC. And I think within the VC community, there is generally a lack of females, but certainly within the tech industry, there is. And then when we kind of look further into tech in itself, it gets smaller. And I find it hugely inspiring, just kind of listening to her career, seeing where she's at now and her growth. For me, that's hugely inspiring. So those are, I'd say, are my 3/3.5.
We'll allow it. Thank you, Shefali. And how can the audience find out a bit more about you and your company?
Sure. So I can be reached and I can be seen on LinkedIn fairly often. And that's where I, am quite well networked and can certainly be kind of checked out, as it were, on a work capacity. I work for a company called Doccla, and they have their own website, but equally I have more information on my LinkedIn about them as well. They are a digital health organisation. They provide virtual wards and remote patient monitoring. And it's a real sweet spot of mine to work for companies with a social impact and a social mission. And this certainly serves that purpose. So you can check them out on their website or on my LinkedIn.
Amazing. Thank you, Shefali. And what can our audience do to help you?
What can the audience do? I would say support and elevate and empower each other. I think building a community, around each other is really important. And I think by them doing that, it supports all of us, not just individually me, but supports all of us as a community, as a female. And I'd say kind of the work that Bay is doing is already doing that. So I'm sure that the audience that you've captivated would certainly be interested in that. So I'd say keep going, Bay, and obviously to the audience, keep watching as well, because it helps to elevate others.
Absolutely. Any final words from you?
No, thank you. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful having you on.
Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.